Long had he waited, but his plan ultimately led to his own undoing.
How you get so big to do food of this kind?
Hello and welcome in. I am going to be discussing the role of former Emperor Palpatine in Star Wars Episode 9, The Rise of Skywalker. If for some reason you still haven't seen the movie and you're about to watch this video, please be aware there's going to be massive spoilers for the movie. I think we've started to hit the point where that should be obvious, but I'm still going to throw my little warning out there that spoilers lay beyond this point. With this video, I wanted to talk a little bit about how I interpreted Palpatine's plan, everything that's going on in the movie, and really just talk about the plan of Palpatine, talk a little bit about him coming in on the third act, how that felt, that sort of thing, and kind of break that down in this video. Ultimately, at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter if he was planned from the beginning or if he was something that was added in, because at the end of the day, he is in Episode 9, the story is what it is, and to break it down thematically, it just adds clutter to factor in whether or not he was supposed to be there. But at the same time, there is a little bit of context with that I think will add, and so I want to start with that. But my ultimate goal is to really just break down what was going on in the movie itself. Alright, so rewind. Over a year ago, we had no idea what was going on with this movie. We had no idea what the title was. Then we get to Star Wars Celebration in April, we get a title, we get a trailer, and we get the information that Emperor Palpatine is back, and he is going to be the ultimate baddie for this trilogy. There's been a lot of debate as to whether or not this was always planned, and my answer on that is kind of yes and no. I'll never know. I was never in the board meetings. I don't know Kathleen Kennedy personally as much as I would love to. I've never got to talk to J.J. Abrams. And I think at the end of the day, some of this stuff is just insider things that they won't ever tell us. But my gut instinct, and I talked a little bit about this, I think, in our longer stream on the movie. But basically, we originally had J.J. Abrams, Rian Johnson, Colin Trevorrow. And they were each writing their own movies. I fully believe that if JJ had this trilogy from the beginning, he would have had Palpatine as the baddie from the beginning, no matter what. And I think he didn't because either it wasn't going to go where Ryan or Colin were going to go. I don't know if it was a he didn't want to put them in that corner. I don't know if it was a he was told not to put them in that corner or how all that came about. But I think ultimately the reason why it didn't come out in Force Awakens is because JJ was never doing 9 from the get-go. But I do believe a lot of this was in the cards, and my reasoning for that, I've said in other things, you go to something like the Aftermath trilogy, which was developed around the same time as The Force Awakens, you have the planet of Jakku, you have the planet that Rey is from, being really, really critical to the Emperor. And I've just never thought that was going to ultimately end up being a coincidence, and I was going to be really let down if it was a coincidence. Go to The Last Jedi. A lot of people like to think that Rise of Skywalker really undoes everything in The Last Jedi, and I'm not really going to get into that entirely. But when you have Kylo killing Snoke in The Last Jedi, there's a lot going on there. Like, I definitely felt like the obvious thing was we were going to get some other kind of big, if not a big bad, some other kind of villain killing Kylo's master in The Last Jedi while not giving Kylo redemption in The Last Jedi just didn't really make a whole lot of sense. It left the trilogy without a villain unless there was a plan to bring in another villain. And the way I said that, I didn't mean that as a shade on Last Jedi. I really liked Snoke dying in The Last Jedi. It was one of the moments that really threw me for a loop because I wasn't expecting it, and I thought that was great. But it left open something else that was going to happen. If it wasn't going to be another big bad, it was going to be a fractured First Order, which we saw to some degree in The Rise of Skywalker, just not to the degree I was necessarily expecting. But I just think that it was not ever fully confirmed that Palpatine was coming back, that Rey was going to be a Palpatine, and that all of these other things were going to happen. But I also think it was in the realm of possibility and one of the things that was being bandied about. So I think that the arguments that this could have been set up better in the first two films are completely valid, but I also reject the notion that it came out of the clear blue sky. There's any number of people in our own community, in our own Discord, who thought a Rey Palpatine made sense. People had been theorizing for a while about Jakku. It didn't come out of the clear blue sky. It also wasn't on a giant blinking neon sign. That's all I'm really going to get to into that discussion. This is what we have. Palpatine came in. What are the seeds in The Force Awakens and The Last Jedi, and really what was his plan in The Rise of Skywalker, which is something that is actually changing a lot, which actually I don't think is that uncommon for Palpatine. Palpatine likes to talk a lot about how he can see the future. He is able to plan all of these wild things, and certainly he manipulates things in the prequel trilogy brilliantly, playing both sides of the war, so it really didn't matter which side won made sense, but it also showed that he's a planner who's flexible. If Palpatine was all about one plan all of the time and he's never going to change it, then he would have had either the Republic or the Confederacy of Independent Systems set up to win that war, and that was going to be how it was going to go. Instead, he had it very strategically set up so that no matter what side won, it put him in power, either because he was already in control of one army or because his apprentice was controlling the other. I think it's very normal for Palpatine to have this big scale plan, but also have 4 or 5 different ways that plan can come through and come to fruition. You also look at Return of the Jedi, and this is a part that's always kind of stuck out to me in Return of the Jedi, is Vader goes to talk to the Emperor in the Death Star, and he's like, there's a small rebel team that's landed in the moon. Palpatine's like, yes, I know. And then Vader's like, my son is with him. Palpatine said that he didn't know this, and Vader says that he's felt his presence, and Palpatine says, strange that I have not. Then, at the end of that scene, he goes, you will go and get your son, and he will come to you, and you will bring him before me, and says, I have foreseen it. So now, all of a sudden, he claims to have this vision of Luke, and I think he does. I think Palpatine is very good at planning, and very good at seeing the future when he can look into it. But, he can only see what he's looking at, and his problem is, he has so much overconfidence that he's not always looking at all of the pieces, but he can adapt. We see him adapting in Return of the Jedi, when he finds out that Luke is going to be there, and he can sense some conflict in Vader, and he knows something's coming. And at this point, again, Palpatine has set up both sides. Either this conflict is going to end with Vader killing Luke, and he has the same apprentice he's already is used to, and he comes off no worse for wear. Or Luke kills Vader and turns to the dark side, and then Palpatine has an even better apprentice. Potentially an apprentice whose body he can possess. Now that we've seen Rise of Skywalker, and we see that, like, possessing a new body seems to be part of Palpatine's plan, it's not that out there to be like, I'm gonna turn Luke to the dark side, and then I'm gonna take over Luke's body. Obviously, not spelled out in Return of the Jedi. Obviously, not in George Lucas's mind when he made it, but in the context of the films we have now, not that out there of a theory either. So all of this is just to say that Palpatine having a plan that twists and turns while also being really big and large is totally in line with the character. Yeah, it can be frustrating that his plan feels like it changes multiple times in The Rise of Skywalker, but that's Palpatine for you. That's just what he does. Okay, so now let's start talking about his plan in the sequel trilogy itself. There's a lot of things we still don't know. Some things that may come out in the novelization by Ray Carson that's going to come out in a couple of months. Some things that may or may not happen in Project Luminous, because as of right now, we're still a couple of weeks from learning about what Project Luminous is. So Project Luminous could have absolutely nothing to do with it. We don't know. But we don't know exactly how everything with Palpatine happened. I have to be honest with you, I'm actually really relieved about that. If you go back to the stuff we had, the videos we did about Rise of Skywalker before the movie came out, I said that Palpatine coming back was my one worry. That they were going to do it in a way that was dumb, that didn't make sense, they were going to do it in a way that undid Anakin Skywalker as the chosen one, and I was kind of worried because I thought that they would have to make him come back in the easiest, simplest way for the general audience, which would leave out the nuance that his return would probably need in order for it to make sense. Instead, they really just don't explain it in the movie. He is back. He's on that weird contraption. Dom Monaghan says that it's probably like cloning or Sith magic or something, but it's never really spelled out which one it is. I think that's a giant relief. I get why it bothers people because you really want to know that answer. Whatever the answer is, it's going to be so crazy and ridiculous. I would rather it be done in a novel or a guidebook or something that could really be done in a really deep cut sort of way and not something that, Uncle Larry isn't going to understand because he fell asleep halfway through the movie. I am relieved by this. I understand why people are not, but I think it was the better call to kind of leave it nebulous for now. But I say all of that to say that it's really hard to say what the start of his plan is because we don't know when he came back. Like, is it a resurrection ship from Battlestar Galactica type thing? Like, as soon as he died in Return of the Jedi, did his essence just, like, zip to Exegol? Or was he lost in the nether regions of the Force for a long time until the Sith Eternal cultists that we see in the film, like, find him and stick him in that body? We don't know. I'm still totally fine with not knowing because I liked the story of what was going on so much. This just means that I'll get that story expanded on for me in some way. What we do know is that Palpatine was every voice that Kylo ever heard in his head as Ben Solo, and that he is responsible for Snoke. We see the two Snokes in a vat thing, and that's really important. I think that we saw two of them, because that shows us really that Snoke was some kind of experiment. Otherwise, we would have just thought that he was like the pickled remains of Snoke from the Supremacy. I have thoughts on how all of this works out, but it's a little difficult to say specifically because we don't know when Palpatine came back as of the day that I'm recording this video, which happens to be December 28th. It's going to be released far later than the day I recorded. But let's follow what we know. We know that Ben Solo was plagued and tormented by the dark since the time of his birth. Knowing that Palpatine was back makes this make a lot more sense, because up until this point it's been like, who's Snoke? Why does he care about any of these people? Why does he want to take over? Well, if he's a puppet of Palpatine, that makes sense, and it also makes sense why somebody would really come after Ben Solo, why somebody would come after the grandson of Darth Vader, and especially not the grandson of just Darth Vader, but the grandson of the troublesome queen and senator of Naboo that caused Palpatine all of these problems, and the troublesome senator and rebellion leader in General Leia Organa. I mean, yeah, he'd want revenge on Luke Skywalker too, but it's not like Ben's line is entirely just his grandfather and his uncle. There's a lot going on there. So, Palpatine, either as I'm sitting on a rack over here, or just as a Force spirit, starts plaguing Ben Solo in the Aftermath trilogy. A lot of people always assume this was Snoke. If I'm remembering correctly, the book never expressly says it's Snoke in Life Debt. We've always assumed it was Snoke because it was a nebulous being that didn't really have a name. At the time, the only person with a vested interest in Ben Solo, who was on the dark side, was Snoke. So the people who were telling you that, like, Snoke was doing it in the Aftermath trilogy, they're doing it based off of assumptions of information we had at the time. I think it's safe to say that this was Palpatine. We don't even know if, like, Snoke was up and running yet at the time of that. If you're interested in the Aftermath trilogy, I highly recommend reading it. We also have like a book club series on all three of the books where I talked about some of that in the context of the chapters it happens, if you're interested in that. One critique about Palpatine's plan that I hear a lot about is, why was he only going after Ben and not Rey, his own granddaughter? Firstly, we don't know that he wasn't going after Rey, but that's entirely besides the point. I think that there's a couple of things that's going on here. One, remember that Ben Solo is 10 years older than Rey. He couldn't start tormenting Rey because she wasn't born yet. At the time, he wanted somebody, probably a body, to possess and come back as. He wanted to take revenge on the Solo Skywalker family. He only had Ben. There was no one else. So that's why he started picking on Ben and not Rey. By the time Rey is born, he's had 10 years invested in this other puppet that he would absolutely want to start working on. So that, to me, is the biggest thing. Now, the other kind of wild card that we don't know a lot about here is Palpatine's son, Rey's father. Kylo says in the movie that your parents were nothing because they chose to be. We know that the son of Palpatine and his wife were on the run. What we don't know is how long they were on the run. Another thing people are kind of jumping to the conclusion on is that Palpatine's son, we'll just call him Dad for the sake of argument in this movie, we'll just say Dad was born because Palpatine got it on at some point in time. I think when you have Palpatine and we have Snoke in a vat and all of these things, especially if you go to the Kieran Gillen Vader comics where he had that one scientist, Silo, who was experimenting with a lot of things. Palpatine really liked experiments. He really liked Sith spawn. He really liked that kind of thing. I think that it's very possible that Dad, Palpatine's son, was an experiment. He was like a test tube baby. That he is Palpatine's son by DNA, because Palpatine was trying to create a body. Like, it's possible that Palpatine's son is Palpatine's son in the same way that Boba is Jango's son, I guess is what I'm trying to say. And he could have been, maybe not born out of a body, maybe he was born out of a person, but I think whatever was going on with him was an experiment. My gut instinct is that Rey's dad was not Force sensitive. That's my gut, because if he was, I don't think he would have been able to hide from Palpatine, because Palpatine would have cared about him, would have been trying to hunt him down, and he would have had a significantly harder time hiding because of his Force sensitivity. Whereas if he's not Force sensitive, then he's literally a failed experiment who got away, who's just this nothing nobody guy. And if he tells this great story about how he's the test tube son of Emperor Palpatine, people are going to think he's nuts. There's no reason to spend resources on hunting down a failure as far as Palpatine would be concerned, because he'd be more concerned about the next experiment, whether that's working on Ben Solo, whether or not that's working on Snoke. My gut instinct is that Rey's dad actually was nobody. He was a failed experiment. I could be proven wrong in a matter of weeks or months. And just know, again, that I'm recording this on I keep checking the watch I don't have. I'm recording this on December 28th, 2019. So if I'm wrong about that, that's why. Palpatine would become interested when Rey was born, because Rey would have been born Force sensitive. I think Rey being on Jakku is a little bit like Luke being on Tatooine as a gambit. They hid Luke on Tatooine because it's the place Vader would never want to go back to. I don't think Palpatine had a problem with Jakku, but I think hiding Rey on Jakku is a place that is so imbued with, like, the feelings of Palpatine, because again, we learn in the Aftermath books that he had an observatory there. Jakku was critical to his Operation Cinder plan, where he basically, if you're not familiar with it, it's in Shattered Empire, the comic, Aftermath trilogy, Battlefront 2 story campaign, or Alphabet Squadron. Any of those sources, if you want to read something kind of primary instead of hearing it from me, I recommend all of those things. I haven't actually played Battlefront 2, but I've watched it, and it looks really interesting. Basically, he was punishing the galaxy for allowing him to lose. So you have Palpatine, who is currently, like, wrecking all of these things. Jakku is central to that. Jakku is where the contingency plan really kind of took into effect, and, like, all of this stuff kind of started. Jakku was central to that plan, Operation Cinder, and the contingency. And so I think putting Rey on Jakku is like, he has a harder time sensing her because he would already sense himself on that planet, if that makes sense. Like, it's trying to find a blue sock in a pile of laundry that's all blue shirts. Like, you're gonna find it because the sock is different, but it's just gonna look like the same as everything else that's there. I don't know if that analogy makes sense. I think that Palpatine started with Ben because that's all he had. Wasn't working on his son because his son was a nobody, was not important to him. Starts caring about Rey either when she's born or when he discovers that she exists, which is why he sends his assassin after her parents. They hide her on Jakku because they don't want her to know. At that point, maybe Palpatine does torment her, and we don't know it. Maybe he doesn't. Maybe he doesn't know where she is because of the whole hiding on Jakku thing. We don't necessarily know all of the moving bits and bobs, but we do know that Palpatine continues to work on Ben through Snoke. Some of this is getting written out in the currently releasing Rise of Kylo Ren comic by Charles Soule. I've read the first issue of that. The other 3 issues aren't even out yet at the time I'm recording this, so it's hard to really say. But we see Snoke has been working on Ben for some time. I think that Snoke is a body that Palpatine either could not successfully possess or didn't want to, so Snoke is acting as Palpatine's body, kind of going out into the universe. I think that Snoke was probably aware that he was working for Palpatine, but I also think Snoke had his own sentience. I don't think he was a pure puppet. I think that when Ben finds Vader's helmet, whenever that happens, that it is Palpatine's voice talking to him through there, because it certainly wouldn't be Anakin's talking as Vader. It's possible that Kylo did have Palpatine in his brain as Snoke, separate from Snoke's own voice, but even still, Snoke as an extension of Palpatine would make Palpatine's line from The Rise of Skywalker make sense. So now you have Snoke being the body, where Palpatine still can't, because he still can't have a body, working and controlling all of these things. It explains where Snoke gets all of this, not force power, but, like, military power from, the ability to even, like, start the First Order, because he'd be kind of this follower of Palpatine. It explains Snoke's Sith obsession while never actually taking the title of Sith itself. It just, a lot of things I think actually kind of make more sense about Snoke and the idea that he was working for Palpatine the whole time, rather than it being a reversal. So now I want to talk about the Rise of Skywalker itself, because like I said, exactly what Palpatine was doing with Ben and Rey prior to this movie, we don't really know, but I think there's pieces and places where it can happen. I will say that I still hold that Snoke's line from the Last Jedi of "I bridged your minds" is still either not completely true or an outright lie. We know now that they're a dyad in the Force. This would be the scene in Force Awakens, the interrogation scene, "Don't be afraid, I sense it too." Like, it's not just the Force that he's sensing in her, but their bond, they're aware of it in that moment, I think. I always thought that that could be the point where the bond was formed. I think that's probably more the point where the bond was activated. I do think that it could have been Snoke / Palpatine that caused them to have the first Force Skype and literally built the bridge in between their minds, but I don't think it's Snoke or Palpatine that's the reason why they were allowed to have them, nor do I think that Snoke or Palpatine were in complete and utter control of those moments. I just think the bridging of the minds was important to the plan. So what is the plan? We get to the Rise of Skywalker. The opening of Rise of Skywalker is Kylo arriving on Exegol. He has every intention of killing Palpatine at this point. Like, he just runs in. He's probably freaking out because he sees Snoke stuff everywhere. But he had every intention of killing Palpatine, and what stops him... At first, it's the, hey, I can offer you my empire. But it's also the, you need to kill the scavenger, and let me tell you who she really is. And once he knows who she really is, that's when the game really changes for him. And part of this is it makes their bond make sense. Kylo is aware of this dyad. We've been seeing in the visual dictionary that Snoke was obsessed with, like, this prophecy of a dyad, so whether or not Snoke knew they were, I don't think he knew they were, but he may have heard about what this is from Snoke, learned it from him, suddenly contextualizes, understands that's what he has with Rey. I don't think Kylo ever intended to serve Palpatine, but instead started serving Palpatine until he could find Rey, get Rey to the dark, and kill Palpatine. And that was always Kylo's plan. But Kylo's plan is for an entirely different video. Palpatine's plan. As I said at the beginning, Palpatine is really big on having all possible options work out for him. So, he does not want Kylo and Rey united. Kylo and Rey united is really bad news bears for him, and he's aware of it. He has probably also seen visions of either Rey on the throne, or at least Rey defeating him, as he said, and he is probably most afraid of that. I think he sets up Kylo to kill Rey, because if he kills Rey, then he's good to go. Palpatine still has a body, he can take over, everyone's happy. If Rey kills Kylo, knowing that there's some sort of bond or connection between them, even though he's unaware that it's a dyad, makes it more likely that Rey could be pulled to the dark side, turn Rey to the dark side, he possesses Rey, he's happy. Palpatine is happy regardless of who wins in the Kylo versus Rey fight. Palpatine loses if they're united, which is why he doesn't send Kylo to go get Rey, he sends Kylo to go kill Rey. And it's why Palpatine calls Kylo out when he realizes that Kylo is trying to work with Rey. He's aware that this is the problem. In fact, after Ben's redemption scene, Palpatine is talking to Pride, and it says the Princess of Alderaan has really put a wrench in my plans, and blah blah blah. Redeeming Kylo was never what he wanted. He did not want Ben Solo back, because Ben Solo back means it's going to be harder to get Rey to join the dark side, and if Ben Solo's a good guy, probably makes it harder to possess him, because whatever the caveat is, it seems to be, I need a darksider body to possess. So Ben going good really wrecks his whole plan, and at this point, he has to start spinning his wheels. So he's like, okay, what would cause Rey to go to the dark side? Killing me. I need to get her so mad because I killed her parents that she wants to come and just wreck me, and I know she's really ticked off right now, so that's what we're gonna try to do. And then it almost works, and then Rey ends up being involved with Ben's redemption, running off to talk to Luke, and getting, like, her good guy pep talk. So really at that point, this is where Palpatine is starting to, like, be in trouble. He's really already losing at this point, so he has to lay on the bravado to make it seem like he's not losing. Rey brings herself to Exegol, brings all of the resistance to Exegol, and this is where she faces off with Palpatine. He's like, I never wanted Kylo. Bull crap. Like, anybody who takes anything Palpatine says at face value is just mistaken. Palpatine never cared which one was dead. He just wanted one of them dead. He's like, I never wanted Kylo. I wanted you, Empress Palpatine. Take the throne. If you, like, kill me and let me possess you, then you'll control the army, and your friends won't die. Only you won't actually care, because you'll be possessed by me, and you'll probably kill them anyway. Like, it was such an epic point, where he's just like, kill me, sucker. It's what I want. And it almost makes me think of Obi-Wan Kenobi, like, strike me down, I'll become more powerful than you can possibly imagine. This is Emperor Palpatine, like, hey, actually, this time, if I get struck down, I'll become more powerful than you can possibly imagine. And then it really doesn't go his way because of how that fight goes and how Rey stays true to the light. Ultimately, I think Palpatine is defeated because his power is turned back on him. He's kind of forced to take the brunt of his own evil. I think some of what Rey is doing there matters. If you want my thoughts on Palpatine dying and my thoughts on how that's possible and what Rey did, I really recommend you check out my Who is Rey video that I did earlier on the channel, because that's where I really kind of go into his death and I don't want to repeat myself. So when you're done with this video, if you haven't checked that one out, I would recommend checking that out, because that's really where I get into the end of Palpatine. But really, this was a video about his plan, and I think his plan was always to possess either Kylo or Rey, and things change. And I think that he really does find out they're a dyad when he's like sucking energy out of them on Exegol, and he's like, oh, not only do you have a bond, you have a super bond. And at that point, his plan changes again, because he doesn't need either body. When he was on the machine and he's like, Rey, kill me with that lightsaber and follow the dark side, I'll possess you. Why doesn't he possess Rey when he dies? Well, because it's a completely different situation. At that point, he's presumably alive still because of whatever the machine was on his back. Then, after he has drained energy out of Rey and Kylo, he doesn't need the machine, he's up and moving around, it's a completely different situation. If he's not attached to the machine, it's probably, you know, the transfer process is probably not going to work anymore, depending on whatever that old tech is. So all in all, I think that you have this situation where the procedure doesn't matter anymore once he's off the machine. Secondly, he says that you have to strike me down with the saber. Rey doesn't strike him down with the saber. She doesn't strike him at all. She deflects his own energy back at him. And so it's the strength of his energy, the strength of the light side of the Force coming against him, and that's what destroys him. She doesn't do it in hatred. She doesn't hate him. She's just really, really focused. So that's really what it is to me. I don't think it's a reversal. I just think there's a situation where he's on the machine and she's standing before him, and then there's the situation where he's like not on the machine anymore and already like souped up a bunch of the Force life. And I think that's different. But hopefully this video made any kind of sense. I didn't have it scripted, so I was just kind of going. And hopefully it helped you make sense of the movie, if this is something that you were struggling with, or something where you just felt like Palpatine just kind of showing up didn't make a whole lot of sense. Oh, I should talk about the Final Order and like all the super weapons on the ships. That didn't bother me either. If this was somebody else, like if this was still Snoke, if this was a different big bad, I would have found the super weapon thing tired. But the super weapon thing is Palpatine's thing. Like, Palpatine wasn't going to come back from the dead and be like, you know, what if we tried biological weapons? Like, this was, super weapons were always in the game for Palpatine. So if you're getting Palpatine back, it makes sense. I talked before about the contingency plan, Operation Cinder, the Empire punishing itself for losing its Emperor. That's why I think the Final Order makes sense. Palpatine didn't necessarily want to rule over, like, a super awesome metropolis-filled galaxy. Like, he wanted to come in and wreck a bunch of stuff. And that was something that was already set up in all of this stuff. Like I said, Aftermath, Alphabet Squadron, Battlefront 2, comic books. Like, we've seen in so many different media this idea that Palpatine wanted to wreck the galaxy to punish it for him dying. And so it made total sense to me that he would have, in fact, it felt like a really good connection and a really good reward for having read all this stuff, to see Palpatine's game is still to wreck everything to punish them for him dying in the first place. Like, I thought that made complete and total sense with the character. I get if you think it's redundant, I get it if you think that it's something you've seen before, but it can both be something you've seen before and also just make sense with the character. I mean, no one is like, man, why did Obi-Wan still use a lightsaber in A New Hope? We saw him use a lightsaber through the entire prequel trilogy. Like, I'm sick of lightsabers. Like, no one says that. So that's my interpretation of Palpatine in this movie, how I saw his plan. It is really twisty and turny. There is a lot going on, but I think the number one thing to remember with Palpatine is always that he always has 2 or 3 viable outcomes to any scenario that benefit him. So when it seems like he's changing his mind, it's really more that he's always had options and he's just picking which option to go for. And I think that makes total sense with the character. But let me know what you thought. If you think anything else is still wonky with the story, I love talking to you guys. If you aren't already, please follow us on all of the socials. And until next time, keep it real and fly casual.
Cooking can be fun.